Ghana. For centuries, that name has meant wealth. They called it the Gold Coast for a reason. A land flowing with riches, a jewel of West Africa. And today, it's not just gold. It's oil gushing from beneath the Atlantic. It's cocoa, the food of the gods, growing in its fertile soil. Ghana stands as one of Africa's economic heavyweights and a beacon of stability in a region that's seen its share of turmoil. On paper, Ghana is rich. In the headlines, Ghana is rich. In its vibrant culture and proud history, Ghana feels rich. But there's a question that echoes from the packed streets of Accra to the quiet farming villages of the Ashanti region. If this nation is so wealthy, so blessed with the planet's most wanted resources, why are so many of its people struggling? How can a country that shipped over $11 billion worth of gold in 2024 still be facing an economic crisis, crippling debt, and a cost of living that just keeps climbing? Why are its bright, ambitious young people fighting for jobs? This is the great Ghanaian paradox. A story of immense wealth living right next door to a story of immense struggle. We're going to follow the money, from the deep mines to the international markets, from offshore oil rigs to the government's bank accounts, and from a humble cocoa pod to the fancy chocolate bars sold across the world. We're going to uncover the truth about Ghana's wealth, to understand the tangled systems and historical currents that decide where it all goes. Is the rich label a reality for its people, or is it just a beautiful, tantalizing myth? Imagine a country that's Africa's #1 gold producer, a nation that, in just the first few months of 2025, exported billions of dollars in gold. Now, imagine that while all this wealth is flowing out, the country's own central bank is struggling to build up its own gold savings, keeping just a tiny fraction of what it produces. It's a head-spinning contradiction. A river of gold flowing out, with only a trickle saved for a rainy day. This isn't some classroom theory. This is the reality in Ghana. So where's all that wealth going? To answer that, we have to start with the resource that gave the country its colonial name: gold. The story of Ghana is, in many ways, the story of gold. For over 1,000 years, the precious metal has been pulled from its lands, building empires, drawing traders from across the Sahara, and later from across the seas. The powerful Ashanti Empire built its legendary strength on gold. Their golden stool, said to have descended from the heavens, wasn't just a throne. It was the soul of the nation, forged in gold. When the Europeans arrived, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Swedes, the British, they weren't there for the weather. They were drawn by the glitter. They built castles along the coast, not to admire the beaches, but to control the trade in gold and, tragically, in human lives. They named the land, simply, the Gold Coast. Fast forward to today, and the scale of the operation is almost beyond belief. Ghana is Africa's top gold producer and consistently ranks in the world's top 10. In 2024, the country's gold exports shot up to a staggering $11.6 billion, a more than 50% jump from the year before. This single resource brought in 57% of the country's total export earnings, making it the undeniable engine of the national economy. The numbers paint a picture of a nation sitting on a literal gold mine. And yet, this is where the paradox kicks in. If you land in Accra and talk to the average person, a small business owner, a student, a public sector worker, you won't hear stories about streets paved with gold. You'll hear about painfully high inflation. You'll hear about the struggle to find a decent job. And you'll hear about a national economy that, despite these massive gold revenues, went through such a severe crisis, it had to get a multi-billion-dollar bailout from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. How can both be true? How can you export $11.6 billion in gold one year and be in an economic crisis at the same time? The answer is a tangled web of contracts, tax laws, and the basic structure of the global mining industry. When a huge multinational mining company, think Newmont or Gold Fields, sets up in Ghana, They operate under what's called a tax royalty system. The government makes money in a few key ways. There's a 35% tax on corporate income and a standard 5% royalty on the gross revenue from the gold sold. The government also gets a 10% free carried stake in most major mines, meaning it owns 10% without having to pay for the expensive setup costs. On the surface, it doesn't sound too bad. But the devil is in the details. First, that 35% tax is on profits, not total revenue. And multinational corporations are wizards of creative accounting. They have perfectly legal ways to minimize their declared profits in Ghana, like management fees paid to a parent company overseas or interest on internal loans, which shrinks their tax bill. The 5% royalty is more straightforward. But think about it. For every $100 of gold pulled from Ghanaian soil, the country is guaranteed just $5. The other $95 belongs to the company, which then pays taxes on whatever profit it declares. According to the Ghana Chamber of Mines, the average share of mineral revenue that actually returned to the country between 2020 and 2023 was nearly 75%, a figure that includes taxes, royalties, and local spending. While that sounds high, it still means a huge chunk of wealth leaves the country. As for the 10% stake, that only pays dividends if the company decides to distribute profits, which they often don't, choosing instead to reinvest. This whole setup leads to a situation where most of the wealth from Ghana's gold flows out of the country, onto the balance sheets of foreign corporations. Ghana is, in essence, exporting its finite natural heritage in its rawest form and getting just a fraction of its value in return. To its credit, the government is trying to fix this. A new state entity, the Ghana Gold Board, was set up to get a better handle on the sector. And in a major shift, the Bank of Ghana started a program to buy gold directly from mining companies in the local currency, the cedi. It's a strategic move to finally build up the nation's own gold reserves as a buffer against economic shocks. But there's another, more chaotic side to Ghana's gold story. Artisanal and small-scale mining, known locally as galamsey. This sector has exploded and now accounts for over a third of the country's total gold output. In fact, between February and May of 2025, it was reported that exports from these small-scale miners actually outpaced the large corporate mines for the first time ever, bringing in $4 billion. On one hand, galamsey provides a living for hundreds of thousands of Ghanaians left out of the formal economy. On the other, it's an environmental catastrophe. It's a primary driver of deforestation, and the use of mercury and cyanide has poisoned rivers and farmland for generations to come. It's also plagued by child labor and violent conflict. The government is trying to crack down on the illegal side of it, but it's a monumental task. The gold paradox, then, is a story of two Ghanas. One is the Ghana of the corporate boardroom and billion-dollar export figures. The other is the Ghana of the polluted river, the struggling farmer, and the national treasury that sees only a slice of the immense wealth that lies right under its feet. We're just scratching the surface here. The patterns we see in gold, vast resources, complicated profits, show up again in Ghana's other big industries. It's a complex picture, and if you're finding this breakdown useful, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We go deep on global economics like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's next. If gold is Ghana's ancient treasure, oil is its modern jackpot. When the discovery was announced in 2007, a wave of optimism swept the nation. By the end of 2010, the oil was flowing. This, everyone believed, was the catalyst. This would finally launch Ghana into the big leagues. The oil money was seen as the cure for everything. It would build new roads, modern hospitals, world-class schools, and finally end the cycle of borrowing and aid. Ghana knew all about the resource curse that had hit other oil-producing nations, where oil wealth brought corruption and conflict instead of prosperity. To avoid that fate, Ghana was smart. It passed the Petroleum Revenue Management Act in 2011, a law praised around the world as a model for transparency. The Petroleum Revenue Management Act laid out a clear plan. It created two new savings accounts, the Ghana Stabilization Fund, to protect the budget when oil prices crashed, and the Ghana Heritage Fund, an endowment for future generations who would never see the oil itself. A watchdog committee, the PIAC, was created to make sure the government was spending the money properly. It was a masterclass in planning. And for a while, it worked. Production from the new oil fields climbed, hitting a peak of around 200,000 barrels per day in 2019. The country's petroleum funds grew, and by the second half of 2024, they had surged to $1.4 billion. But just like with gold, the dream started to drift from reality. The problem wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, creeping crisis of debt. First, the oil money, while helpful, was never the silver bullet people hoped for. It has only ever made up about 4% of Ghana's annual budget, a nice boost, but not enough to transform an entire economy. The much bigger problem was borrowing. The discovery of oil suddenly made Ghana look like a much safer bet to international lenders. With future oil revenues as a kind of collateral, the country found it could borrow money easily. And borrow it did. Ghana went on a spending spree, funding projects with international bonds. The logic seems sound. Borrow against future earnings to build for today. But it created a dangerous trap. The country was spending money it didn't have yet, based on rosy predictions of future oil prices. When those prices inevitably fell, the oil revenues fell short, but the massive debt payments were still due. By 2016, the interest payments on these loans were eating up more than a quarter of all government revenue. It was like saving a few bucks in a 1% savings account while racking up huge debts on an 8% credit card. The situation finally came to a head. A perfect storm of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and homegrown weaknesses pushed Ghana to the brink. Public debt exploded, inflation shot past 40%, and the currency nosedived. In 2023, the government was forced to default on its debts and go to the IMF for a $3 billion bailout. The IMF loan came with strict conditions, a polite term for austerity. This meant cutting spending, removing subsidies on fuel and electricity, and raising taxes. While these moves are meant to stabilize the economy, they inflict real pain on the population. The cost of living goes up, and public services get squeezed. The dream of oil-funded development had turned into a nightmare of debt and austerity. For all its good intentions, the Petroleum Revenue Management Act couldn't prevent this. It was designed to manage the 4% of the budget that came from oil, but it couldn't control the other 96%. The oil boom, instead of leading to economic independence, had accidentally trapped Ghana in a web of global finance, leaving the average citizen wondering what happened to the promise of prosperity. Long before anyone drilled for oil or used modern machines to dig for gold, Ghana's backbone was the cocoa bean. Introduced in the late 19th century, cocoa was perfect for Ghana's fertile lands. For decades, it was the main source of income for millions of people. Today, Ghana is the world's second largest cocoa producer, right behind its neighbor, Côte d'Ivoire. Together, they supply nearly 70% of the world's cocoa. The industry supports over 800,000 farmers and their families. The government agency that runs it all, the Ghana Cocoa Board, is a massive institution. But if you peel back the skin of the cocoa pod, you find a bitter reality. Here's the conundrum. How can a country so dominant in a multi-billion-dollar global industry fail to get that wealth to the very farmers who make it all possible? It all starts on a small family farm. The work is backbreaking. Farmers harvest the cocoa pods by hand, crack them open, and let the beans ferment and dry in the sun. When the beans are ready, they have to sell them to a licensed buyer at a fixed price set by Cocoa Board. That price is locked in for the whole season, no matter what happens on the world market. Cocoa Board then sells the beans to huge international trading houses and chocolate corporations. Companies like Cargill, Hershey's, and Nestle. They're the ones who process the beans and make the chocolate bars that sell for a premium in supermarkets around the world. The global chocolate industry is worth well over $100 billion a year. But the amount of that final price that makes it back to the farmer is shockingly small. On average, a cocoa farmer receives only about 6% of the price of a chocolate bar. While chocolate companies post huge profits, with margins as high as 16%, the vast majority of cocoa farmers in Ghana live in poverty. A typical farming family might earn just over $2,000 a year from their crop, less than half of what's considered a living income. The pricing system is a huge part of the problem. In early 2024, global cocoa prices skyrocketed to historic highs due to poor harvests. This should have been a jackpot for farmers, but it wasn't. They were still getting the low price that Cocoa Board had set the year before. The chocolate companies passed the high costs on to consumers, but the farmers at the very start of the supply chain were left behind. Cocoa Board itself is at the center of this mess. It's meant to be the farmer's champion, but it's often criticized as a bloated, inefficient, and mismanaged bureaucracy. It's also drowning in debt, which makes it even harder for it to help farmers. Due to disease and a lack of support, Ghana's cocoa production has actually been falling sharply. But maybe the biggest failure is the lack of value addition. For decades, Ghana has just been a supplier of raw materials. It exports raw cocoa beans, while the most profitable work, processing, manufacturing, and branding, all happens somewhere else. If Ghana could process more of its own beans into cocoa butter, or even finished chocolate, it could capture a much larger share of the profits and create more jobs. There's a vision for this, called Ghana Beyond Aid, but progress has been painfully slow. The cocoa conundrum perfectly illustrates the imbalances in our global economy. It shows how a country can be a world leader in producing something valuable, yet still be stuck with the poorest part of the business. The wealth from chocolate is real, but it's concentrated thousands of miles away, in the hands of a few powerful corporations. The stories of gold, oil, and cocoa aren't just separate problems. They're the main threads in the bigger story of Ghana's economy. When you zoom out, you see a nation with all the right ingredients for success, but one that keeps getting knocked down by a combination of global shocks and its own internal weaknesses. For years, Ghana was praised as an African tiger. It had strong GDP growth and a stable democracy. But the recent economic crisis has shattered that image and exposed the vulnerabilities that were always hiding just beneath the surface. So what does the economy actually look like? While resources dominate the headlines, the biggest sector is actually services, banking, telecom, retail, which makes up about 45% of GDP. Industry, including mining and oil, is about 25%, and agriculture is around 21%. On paper, that looks pretty diverse. But the whole system runs on foreign currency earned from exporting raw gold, oil, and cocoa. If the price of any of those things drops, the entire economy feels it. This is the legacy of what some call the Guggisberg economy, a colonial-era model where you export raw materials and import finished goods. More than 60 years after independence, Ghana is still struggling to break out of this mold. Without a strong manufacturing sector to produce its own goods, the country has to import everything from cars and phones to clothes and food. This creates a constant need for US dollars to pay for it all. This is where the recent crisis really took off. When the pandemic and the war in Ukraine drove up global prices for fuel and food, Ghana's import bill exploded. At the same time, its currency, the cedi, started to plummet. It was a vicious cycle. A weaker cedi made imports even more expensive, which fueled runaway inflation that peaked at over 50%. For ordinary Ghanaians, the price of everything, from a bag of rice to a bus fare, went through the roof. This was made infinitely worse by Ghana's other huge problem, public debt. By the end of 2023, the government's debt had hit a staggering 85% of GDP, a completely unsustainable level. The government got caught in a debt trap. It had to spend more and more of its money just to pay interest on old loans, leaving less for schools, hospitals, and roads. Eventually, the markets shut the door, and Ghana had no choice but to default and ask the IMF for a bailout. The human cost has been immense. The high cost of living has pushed more people into poverty, and youth unemployment is a massive challenge. Every year, 500,000 young, educated Ghanaians enter the job market, but the economy isn't creating enough good jobs for them. The government is now on a painful path of austerity, trying to get its house in order. There are some early signs of progress. Inflation is slowly coming down, and the economy is growing, thanks again to those gold and oil exports. But the road ahead is long. The deep structural problems, the reliance on raw commodities, the weak manufacturing base, and the vulnerability to global shocks haven't gone away. The big picture shows that Ghana's wealth is fragile. It's a wealth based on digging things out of the ground and shipping them away. That has brought in money, but it hasn't built a tough, resilient economy that can provide for its people in the long run. The richness of the land has not yet translated into the richness of the nation. So, back to the big question. Is Ghana rich? The answer isn't a simple yes or no. The myth of Ghana's wealth isn't really a myth at all. The country is, without a doubt, spectacularly rich in natural resources. It is blessed with gold, oil, cocoa, and so much more. This wealth is real. It's measured in tons and barrels, and it brings in billions of dollars every year. But the reality is where that beautiful myth crumbles. As we've seen, this incredible wealth doesn't automatically create a rich country for the people who live there. We saw it with the gold paradox, where a system built over centuries funnels a finite national treasure out of the country, leaving only a fraction of its true value behind. We saw it with the oil dilemma, where the promise of a modern jackpot instead led to a flood of debt, pulling the nation into a crisis and the arms of the IMF. And we saw it with the cocoa conundrum, which reveals the raw deal at the heart of our global food system, trapping millions of farmers in poverty while chocolate companies a world away reap the rewards. These stories all point to an economy that is still stuck in the past, built on a colonial model of exporting raw materials. It's a model that has left Ghana vulnerable and has failed to build the kind of industrial base needed for lasting prosperity. So, is Ghana rich? Yes, in potential, in resources, and in the spirit of its people. But is that wealth actually working for its 34 million citizens? The evidence says, not yet. The recent crisis has been a painful wake-up call, forcing a national reckoning. The only way forward is to finally build a Ghana beyond aid. A Ghana that adds value to its own resources, that builds factories, that diversifies its trade, and that makes sure every contract it signs is designed, first and foremost, to benefit its own people. The wealth of Ghana is not a myth, it's real. The great challenge for this generation is to finally break the paradoxes of the past and turn that natural wealth into real, lasting prosperity for all. The gold, the oil, and the cocoa belong to Ghana. The question is whether Ghana will one day own the full value of its riches.